All right, I'm not quite sure if anyone can hear me because I keep getting this unmuted, muted message. So can somebody type into the question box if they can hear me? Some of you. Okay, thank you, Tomas. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. That's perfect. All right, so I'm not exactly sure what happened, but clearly now you can all hear. All right, thank you. Saul, thank you very much. That's the last one. All right. So let's see, it's the second in the resilience series. Today, the focus is on understanding cognitive distortions and imposter fears. We're going to talk in detail about those two topics. For those of you who weren't here the last time and missed the introduction, it's taped on our YouTube channel, so you can go and catch up. I'm Sharon Milgram, and I direct the Office of Intramural Training and Education at NIH. And I hope that you are all aware of all of the wonderful things that Dr. Chen and the summer internship program team put together for you, from the workshops focused on getting into graduate school or professional school, to the career exploration workshops. Every Friday is a chance to hear about science from each of the NIH institutes and centers. And we also have a wonderful program where some of our current trainees are talking about their experience at NIH and their career trajectory. So there's something that I hope is interesting for each of you most of the days of the week, if not all of them. Somebody just said they can't hear me, so Yewan, can you just let me know if you can hear me before I start?
I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm going to assume we're okay. All right, so the topic today is understanding cognitive distortions and imposter fears. And I just want to start by reminding you of a few of the important messages from last week's overview of resilience. So first, let's remind ourselves that resilience is the ability to respond to setback and disappointment in a calm, focused, and more productive way. It's the ability to bounce back from a setback, to learn from it, and to keep moving forward. To be resilient, we need to keep these three things in mind, or this simple math equation. Resilience equals people plus process plus preparation. By people, I mean that we talk with and seek support from people who are positive in our lives, who support us, who can help us have perspective. Process, meaning we learn about the process of resilience. We practice what we learn. It means we do self-care like we talked about last week. And today for us, process is that we learn about self-talk and start paying attention to it. And preparation is that we put this into practice every day. We don't put it aside and forget about it and pull it out in the middle of a frustrating or difficult or disappointing time. We're constantly aware of how we're dealing with things. We're constantly working on our resilience. So resilience is people plus process plus preparation. And we talked about this last week, and one of the bullets was to really be resilient, we have to be thoughtful about how we approach setback and how we engage with our negative self-talk, which sometimes people will call inner critic. And so I want to go ahead and spend today focused on that. Just again, a reminder that this will be taped. It is being taped right now. So if you have a problem and you lose sound or you lose reception and suddenly you can't stick with us, no worries. If you're registered, you're going to get a link to the tape and you can watch it later. But hopefully you won't have any issues and you'll be able to stick with us from now till the end. Second thing in the handouts box are the slides from today, resilience_summer 2. Okay, so you can download those now. If you have trouble and you can't download them again, no worries, because today you'll get an email with a link, or actually an attachment, not even a link. You'll get an email with an attachment that contains the slides. A third reminder is that this webinar today will be followed next week by small group discussions. You will get an invitation to join those right after the webinar today. You'll need to register for either the 1 o'clock time slot or the 3 o'clock time slot, and then you'll be put into new groups and meet next week. So I got a couple of questions, one here and a couple earlier by email about will we be able to be in the same group. And while I think there are some nice benefits about being in the same group, there's also some nice benefits about hearing from different people. And logistically, it's pretty hard for us to manage keeping groups the same. People then have a time conflict. We need to figure out another group. So just choose the time that works for you, and we will see you in the groups next week. Remember, it's not required that you attend the groups, but I highly recommend it. So I just want to start our discussion of cognitive distortions and imposter fears by pointing out that we're going to be talking about the thoughts part of this triad. And what we think affects how we feel and act. And we really have control if we think about our thoughts. So in some ways, our thoughts are our cognition, and what I'm talking about is metacognition, or the process of reflecting on our thoughts. So, you know, we have the ability to impact this triangle by focusing on our thoughts. We likewise have the ability to impact this triangle by changing our behavior, or by paying attention, acknowledging our emotions, and working through them. But today, what we'll focus on is the thought part of this. So just remember that these three things are all connected. And as we develop our resilience, we learn ways to control negative thoughts. We learn ways to be in touch with and respond to negative emotions. And we learn ways to choose behaviors that promote a more positive way of engaging with negative thoughts and negative emotions. And furthermore, lots of wellness behaviors help drive positive thoughts and positive emotions. I know this morning I rode my bike over to the middle school and I played tennis against the wall of the middle school. A friend met me there, so she was down on the other end, but we occasionally took a break and chatted. And those behaviors, I noted when I was done, I felt really positive and good and optimistic, and I was ready for the day. So behaviors can help with our thoughts and emotions. Understanding our thoughts, dealing with our emotions can lead to better behaviors. And the more we get how tightly these three things are connected, the better off we're going to do in the long term. But today we're going to talk about thoughts, and we're going to focus in two particular areas. I'm going to teach you a little bit about cognitive distortions, and then I'm going to teach you about a unique type of cognitive distortion known as imposter fears. You might see that online and in other talks as imposter syndrome. I happen to like to use the language of imposter fears, so that's what you'll hear me use today. Often cognitive distortions lead us to feeling really pessimistic about things. And that pessimism leads us to feel sort of helpless and hopeless, like we have no control, that things will just keep getting worse and staying really in a negative space. Imposter fears lead us to feel like we don't belong. And remember that to do well, we really need a sense of belonging. A big part of resilience is people, right? It's being a part of a community. It's engaging with those people. It's being able to reach out when things are tough. And so if we feel imposter fears and they lead us to feel like we don't belong, then we tend not to reach out, or we hang back in groups. And so both of these, understanding both of these is really important in terms of developing our resilience. So I'm going to walk you through this material today pretty quickly, giving an introduction. We'll play around with it a little bit with some examples, and then I'll answer questions. Okay, I'm probably going to get all the way through before I take questions. I don't have that many slides. And so go ahead, if you want to type them in now, go ahead, but appreciate that I may cover it later. And so it might be worth waiting more towards the end to actually put your questions in. So cognitive distortions are also known in the literature as automatic negative thoughts, or ANTs. So my wife is going to go ahead and let the dog in, and the dog has a treat. And so we're going to pause for a moment for him to settle down. I know you could probably hear him barking. He's probably more famous than any other NIH pet at this point. So he's actually pretty quiet now, so I hope that's okay. All right, and I apologize if he starts barking again. So let's define what cognitive distortions are. Appreciate that you can Google both cognitive distortions or automatic negative thoughts as you're learning about this. So what are they? They're characteristic ways that our mind convinces us that things are really worse than they actually are. And our mind does that to reinforce negative thinking about the situation. So it's like putting on a pair of glasses, and those glasses present everything as worse than it really is. It's a way of seeing a situation more negative than it actually is. If we constantly are telling ourselves stories that are more negative than the situation really is, that can lead us to feel really bad about ourselves. And it can make us feel very anxious, very pessimistic. It can drive us to really want to give up. Now, I think it's really important as you learn this material to understand evolutionarily where it came from, because doesn't it seem sort of counterproductive? Something happens, we get a grade we're really disappointed with, or we don't get in, or an internship we worked hard to get gets canceled, right? Something bad happens, and we tell ourselves an even worse story about it. It sort of seems counterintuitive. But if you think about it, evolutionarily, our brain evolved first as a threat sensor with the goal of keeping us safe. Our brain wants us to remember the bad things, so we are always on alert, keeping ourselves safe. So from an evolutionary biology perspective, it makes good sense that our brain is telling us stories that things are worse than they really are. Because first and foremost, our brain is trying to keep us safe. And when you look at actual neuronal structures, right, and study this, you come to appreciate that the amygdala is this threat sensor in the brain, and it is highly tuned to looking for stress. But the beautiful thing is that our amygdala receives all these neuronal connections from other parts of the brain, like our frontal lobe, where our executive functioning resides, where our ability to reason resides. And if we appreciate that we're not under such stress, or the story isn't as bad as it seems, we actually have the ability to slow down that threat sensor. And all of those connections from higher cortical functions, other parts of our brain help us do that. So our amygdala is our old ancient threat sensor. And then on top of that, we have all these other pathways that allow us to sort of calm that threat or put it in perspective. Understanding cognitive distortions allows us to put that characteristic negative story to bed or to rest or out of the way. It allows us to soften that story and appreciate that it's more negative than it really is. Okay, that the story is more negative than it really is. So hopefully that makes some sense. I'm going to try something I have never tried before, and I don't know if it's going to work, but we're going to try. So I'm going to unmute everybody. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through these examples. It is not helpful for me to tell you there are characteristic ways that your mind convinces you that things are worse than they really are. That's nice to know, but that doesn't give you any tools to work with. The important thing here is that there are characteristic ways, i.e. we know a lot about these cognitive distortions or automatic negative thoughts. And so I'm going to give you some examples with a story, and then I think maybe you're all going to be able to vote with your feet, meaning you're going to be able to say me. So let's try that. Okay, let me just hear everybody say me. Let's see if this works. All right, this does not work. So clear. Okay, everybody say me. All right, it doesn't work. So never mind. What you're going to do is just vote using the question box. Okay. And so if this is a cognitive distortion that you really use a lot, that you recognize is like your signature go-to cognitive distortion, you're going to just put in into the question box me. Okay. All right, you are all still muted. I know for whatever reason, I cannot unmute you. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just get a sense of how many people use each of these cognitive distortions. So the first is all or nothing thinking. Our performance is either perfect or it's a complete failure. In this cognitive distortion, we see something as either all good or all bad. So we get our grades for the semester, and we have really had a pretty good semester. We got a nice set of A's and B's. We learned a lot, but we got one C that really was disappointing to us. All or nothing thinking leads us to ignore the fact that we did really well in most of our courses and that we worked quite hard and learned material even in that C. We don't see any of the good. All we see is we see it as a failure. We can't see any gradation between all good or all bad. If you use all or nothing thinking, go ahead and type in me. All right, and it is going crazy. There are at least probably 60 me's. Somebody typed in sometimes me, right? Realizing I do this sometimes, but other times I can do a little bit better with that. All right, so lots of me's. I would estimate a good, maybe half of you put in me. All right, so now we're gonna talk about another one. Everyone stop typing for a minute. All right, catastrophizing. That's when we exaggerate the implications of a setback or mistake. So I have something important that's going to start at 10 o'clock. Or like today, I had this webinar at 2 o'clock. Well, at 1:45, when I logged on, I had all kinds of technical difficulties. My computer first crashed, then I had to reboot it, and then I couldn't load any of my bookmarks or open my calendar, so I know I have to find a link, but I can't. And in my mind, because catastrophizing is my go-to cognitive distortion, here's what I'm saying to myself: oh my God, I'm going to be late. Nobody's going to wait. Everyone's going to leave. It's going to ruin the entire resilience series. Nobody will come back next week after this happens. I'm not going to be able to get on. That's catastrophizing. All right, so how many of you catastrophize? So some people are putting in me with like 3 exclamation points, lots of exclamation points, a few sometimes me's, a few occasional me's, a few people saying me all the time. All right, so lots of people saying I catastrophize. And in my experience, generally a lot of people will share that they catastrophize. And sometimes when we've been able to do a poll, we've seen it could be up to 50 to 60 to 70% of the people. Somebody here pointed out, I usually can catch myself and remind myself it's not such a big deal or bad thing. And that's a lot about what today is. All right, so we had 2 votes for these 2. Let's go on to the next one. These two, I'm going to give two of them together because they go together, mind reading and fortune telling. In mind reading, we make assumptions about what someone else is thinking. So we ask our friend to maybe get together and study with us, or to get together and work on a project together, and they don't answer our text right away, and we just fill in the blank of all of that with assuming, oh, they don't want to do this with me, they think I'm not very helpful, they really don't want to be in a study group with me. That's mind reading. We made an assumption about what they were thinking. And somebody just typed in definitely me. And I see lots more people typing that in. All right. And then fortune telling goes along with it. There, in that case, someone says, maybe you need to study with other people. And you think, well, I won't even ask because they won't want to study with me. That's fortune telling. How many of you do that? Let's go ahead and pop that in. And it's just lots of you. But I want to notice it's not everybody. Somebody just said 100% me, sometimes me again, definitely me, occasionally me, right? So each of you responds in a different way to each of these distortions. And somebody put in not me, actually, right? So somebody realized this one I don't tend to do so much. All right, next one. Emotional reasoning. We assume our emotions are a true reflection of the way things are. So you make a mistake and you have a pretty lousy outcome and you say, oh, that was stupid. So because we feel stupid, right? That was stupid, I feel stupid. Because we feel stupid, we assume we are stupid. Oh, I feel stupid, so I must be stupid. Or we really feel some imposter fears, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Because we feel imposter fears, we assume we are an imposter and we really don't belong. So we take the feeling that we have and we decide it's a real reflection of how things are. And I hear students say to me so often, I'm so stupid, right? And that's an example of emotional reasoning. None of you are stupid, right? You've come this far. You've made a lot of progress in your careers. You're still learning, so we don't know everything, right? None of you are stupid. But sometimes we feel stupid, and so then we say, oh, we are stupid. All right, that's emotional reasoning. The next is overgeneralization. That's when we take one negative event and see other similar events through that same failure. So I took my qualifying exams in grad school and I failed. Part of it, actually, not the whole thing, but I did pretty poorly in one part of it. So then I had to do another exam and I said, well, I'm just going to fail that. And then I had to retake part of my qualifying exam and I put it off and put it off and put it off because I was overgeneralizing. I failed it before, I'm going to fail it again. So we take one negative event and we see other events through that same failure. I didn't get that internship, I won't get the next internship. I didn't get picked for that part in the play, I won't get picked for another part. That's overgeneralization. All right, let's see how many of you do that one. The inbox is full. 100% of the time. Somebody said not anymore me, right? So again, showing some ability to learn how to control these cognitive distortions. Very much me, very often me, 100% me, I do that, me with lots of ease, right? So lots of people overgeneralize. And now another one, personalization. That's when we hold ourselves fully responsible for an outcome that isn't entirely under our control, right? So I'm going to go back to that, an example about time, because it's one that I think is easy to understand. So you have an interview for an internship, and you're supposed to be there at 3 o'clock, and you leave the house in plenty of time to be there, and you take the metro and it shuts down. Or you drive and there's a terrible accident at this main intersection where you have to cross. So you left on time, you made every effort to be there, you're not responsible for what happened. People who personalize things take on all of that responsibility. I'm so sorry, it was my fault, I messed this up. Personalization often, I find, leads right to catastrophizing. It leads to a lot of emotional reasoning, right? And these all sort of come in and play together to make us feel really lousy. But the honest truth is, we're not often fully responsible for an outcome, right? We can be partially responsible, but we're not fully responsible much of the time. We take on lots of blame we shouldn't take. So how many of you personalize? Lots. I definitely do this, is what somebody put in there. Me, always me, classic me, and again, some used to be me's, right? And I think those are really important. Two things here in this exercise are really important. The first is that you're willing to sort of take a look at this and see yourself in it, because the way we start to deal with these is by realizing what we do and watching out for it. So that's a key thing. And the second key thing in this exercise are the people who said, not me all the time anymore, used to be me, but not so much, right? Because that tells us that we have some power over this, that we can really learn to do better in this regard. Now, the last one that I want to talk about is discounting the positive, and I often will use the language of minimizing for this. And this is where we discount positive outcomes and our positive attributes by insisting they don't count. So somebody says, congratulations, that was a great talk. And you say, oh, not really, I made a lot of mistakes. I'm not so good I'm not a good public speaker. Or somebody says, congratulations for getting that internship. Oh, they probably didn't have a lot of strong applicants. I just got in because I was lucky. That's minimizing. So how many of you minimize? And somebody there just very correctly pointed out that I minimize all the time, and that's imposter fears. And you're right, this is minimizing is the cognitive distortion that really underlies imposter fears. And somebody said me 1000%, definitely me. I'm trying not to. That's me so often, me, right? So you get the message here, a couple of messages. One is none of us are alone in this, huh? We can all see ourselves in these cognitive distortions. And in some way, we have to become aware of them and work to do something about them. So thank you all for voting in this really weird way. Somehow it still worked. And we got a sense of just how many of us on this webinar are struggling with this. And the honest truth is we all struggle with this. So Yewan, if you can delete all of the me's while I keep talking, that will help me take questions at the end. So like I said, minimizing is the cognitive distortion that really underlies imposter fears, or the feeling of phoniness in people who believe that they are not intelligent, capable, or creative, despite evidence of high achievement. So there's a great little cartoon there on the side. I suspect some of you have never seen that old-fashioned kind of mouse, or you're all used to trackpads. But those of us who use computers, about a decade ago, are still have some experience with those old-fashioned looking mice. Imposter fears lead us to feel like we don't belong. And the thing is that we need to feel that we belong to take risks and to learn and to grow. We need to feel like we belong to go ask someone for help. We need to feel like we belong to say, no, I actually didn't understand that. Thank you for maybe explaining it to me again. So imposter fears really get in the way of student success. But the honest truth is, so do all those other cognitive distortions that I just talked about. And so learning to recognize our cognitive distortions and our imposter fears and figuring out how to do something about them is really a key resilience skill for students. So I want to talk a little bit more about imposter fears. The person who first discovered imposter fears and reported on them in the literature is Pauline Rose Clance, and she is a psychologist at, I think, either Georgia State University or University of Georgia. I can't remember which one, but you can check out her website for some information. Imposter fears really come in 4 flavors, and I gave some examples already of these, but one is feeling like a fake, right? We aren't really good at this. We're just faking it and someone will figure us out. Problem with feeling like a fake is that we're constantly worried that someone will figure us out. And I think something that happens with this whole idea of feeling like a fake is somewhere out there we've heard fake it till you make it. It's a really common phrase that people tell us. There's something really shaky about feeling like a fake. And so I think maybe what we should say, rather than fake it till you make it, is be willing to acknowledge your learning as you go on, right? Be willing to say, I'm still working on this. And then if you keep working on it, you'll get there. And if you notice, that doesn't sound as good as fake it till you make it. So therefore, that's what we're left with. But I think when we feel like a fake, it makes us feel like any minute now, someone's going to find us out. Imposter fears mean that we attribute success to luck, which is a really dangerous thing. We have to, self-confidence means we own our strengths. I'm good at this, right? And we don't want to attribute all of our success to luck. On the flip side, we want to acknowledge that sometimes we do get a lucky break, right? Sometimes we're in the right place at the right time, but we also want to appreciate that we make our luck by being prepared, by being thoughtful, and by networking, so we know people who might be able to help us. So we don't want to attribute all of our success to luck. It also causes us to discount our successes, right? If we don't attribute them to luck, we attribute them to someone being kind to us or everyone else, a mistake. Somebody once applied to one of our programs, got in, and emailed me and said, I just want to double check, did I really get in, right? So they put all their success into a mistake. And then the fourth is assuming you have to work hard, but the equivalent accomplishment is easy for everyone else. So you have to go home and study. You have to go home and practice. You have to go home and really work hard to learn this material, and everybody else is just cruising. It's just easy for them. They're not studying. They're not going to download more resources, right? You're the only one. Now, I think the internet and social media has really driven this one, right? Because we can look at people's pictures on Instagram, and boy, that can make us feel like they got their stuff together. And then we think, I don't totally have my stuff together. Imposter fears are often a result of a fear of failure, of perfectionist tendencies, and the tendency to compare ourselves to others. So I already talked about that through the internet and social media, but we do that in person too. And in some way, just like we're hardwired to see things sort of through a negative lens, we're also hardwired to compare. But we want to really soften those tendencies to compare ourselves. In terms of perfectionist tendencies, I guess I'll say this, there's no such thing as perfection, right? And often we get so caught in our perfectionist tendencies that we don't move forward on something. And so it would be really good of us to all embrace the idea that there's no such thing as perfection, and to acknowledge that to get to perfection means to chase something we'll never get to. And that might soften the imposter fears for us. And then finally, a fear of failure. That leads to imposter fears. And remember, we talked a lot about growth mindset last week. If we can find our growth mindset, we might be able to embrace our failures just a little bit more, and again, soften imposter fears. So I think it's important to understand where imposter fears come from. And now I want to go a little bit deeper actually into where they come from. and point out a couple of things. The first is that imposter fears are caused simply by being a student. By definition, if you're a student, you still have things to learn. Quite frankly, lifelong learning means we're all students all the time, right? So if you're just starting out in a really hard biochemistry course, well, it makes sense to feel like an imposter. If you go to a lab meeting or a journal club and everybody else has been working in that field for years and they're all talking to each other and you realize, well, I can't follow, that newness in that environment is going to trigger imposter fears. You're trying to learn something new. They have been doing it for a long time. So that's the second cause of imposter fears. Every time you go into an environment that's new or that feels foreign, it triggers imposter fears. The third thing is messages that we get from family and childhood. So if you got a 90 and somebody said, what happened to those 10 points? Or you worked incredibly hard and got a really solid, well-earned B, which is a perfectly good grade. And somebody said, how come you didn't get an A? Right? Those messages drive us towards perfectionism, which drives imposter fears. Or the flip side, in your family, somebody else got all the attention for being the smart one and you were the funny one or the athletic one or the helpful one. And so you got a message of, oh, well, that's not your strength. Those kinds of messages lead to imposter fears. Now, we get messages from our family of origin and the families that we're around, but we also get messages from popular culture, from organizational culture, right? And those messages can drive imposter fears as well. When Pauline Rose Clance started this work, she started her research with the goal of understanding why women didn't do well in academic environments. And in some ways, if you think about it, the messaging around that, especially when she started that work, but still, unfortunately, even sometimes till today, is women don't do well in positions of power, or women don't belong in highly mathematic or computational fields. So that's an example of a message from culture, right? An organizational message could be at NIH, there's a coffee mug, NIH, lots of really smart people. Everyone at NIH puts all their titles after their name. And you're new to that environment and you are just getting there, learning about it. All that message says, oh, you're not ready yet, you don't belong. And so lots of organizational and cultural messages come into play. For people of color, or people underrepresented in an environment, stereotype threat can trigger imposter fears. Stereotype threat is the stress of being the representative of your entire social group. So you are the only woman in an engineering group of 12 people, or you are the only Black person in a lab of 12 people. You walk through the space and you tend not to see people who look like you. That triggers something called stereotype threat. And sometimes students aren't even aware of stereotype threat, right? It's like not actually entered their consciousness, but data shows even some unconscious sense of stereotype threat can get in the way. And so it's really important that we teach this material, because stereotype threat drives imposter fears. Imposter fears drive us to not engage in the learning environment, and that becomes a really negative cycle. The last cause of imposter fears that I want to point out is working in a creative field. And people might say, that's not science. But the honest truth is that science is pretty creative, right? We have to make hypotheses without data and try to figure out how to work with them. We propose experiments. There's some element of creativity to that. So I decided I would leave it on the list. But I think probably the first 5 are the key ones that drive imposter fears, especially in early learners in educational environments. Now, as you could tell from the really unscientific poll we did, lots of people experience imposter fears. And the data from Dr. Clance and others suggest that 70% or more of all people have reported experiencing imposter fears at some point in their educational and work journey. So I think that I want to stress two things. There is nothing wrong with you, and you're not alone. And I think those are two really important things. Same thing about all the other cognitive distortions. Your brain is hardwired to drive you to see things negatively. And you're not alone there either. We all have cognitive distortions that get in our way. So we're all in this together. And not only that, I just want to point out that you are in really good company. So look at these 6 individuals, all of whom have shared their experience with imposter fears at some point. There's Michelle Obama and Sonia Sotomayor. Both of them wrote about imposter fears in great length in their autobiographies. Both are really inspirational reads. The guy in the top row, I can't remember his name right now, but he is the president and CEO of Starbucks. So someone who clearly has impacted almost all of our lives if we've ever stopped at a Starbucks to get a cup of coffee. And in the bottom row, Tom Hanks, the famous actor, Lady Gaga, and Maya Angelou, who is an activist and writer and poet who is incredibly influential in many, many ways. Maya Angelou shares actually in a tape, which you can find on YouTube, that even when her 12th book was published, she felt like, uh-oh, this time people are going to realize that I'm an imposter. This time people will say, this book, I don't know about this. It was really, really an important interview. And so I encourage you to go ahead and listen to that. And at the end, I actually give you a link to some of Maya Angelou's work, not that interview. I tried to find it today and I sort of ran out of time, but hopefully somebody can find it and share it in their group next week. So you're really in good company. Look at all these people and how far they've come and what they've contributed to society and into their fields. And they all talk about imposter fears. The thing about imposter fears is to appreciate that they can sort of come and go. So it's not ever something, we deal with and they're gone. Same thing about the cognitive distortions that get in our way. Sometimes we might be taking care of ourselves a little bit better and they're softer and less bothersome. And then sometimes we might lose sight of our self-care. We might hit one setback after another, and suddenly those cognitive distortions are really yelling at us. And so it's really worth it for us to fully understand how these work so that we can start tackling them. And the first thing that you need to appreciate in all of that is that cognitive distortions and imposter fears are just a major part of the stories we tell ourselves. They just are. Our brain is hardwired to see things negatively because it is hardwired to keep us safe. And so they're a major part of the stories we tell. And sadly, imposter fears and cognitive distortions can come from others. So people can say to us, students like you don't belong in this class. Or someone can respond to our mistake by catastrophizing it, right? So you talk to your advisor about your grades. We go back to that really good semester, one grade you're less happy about. And that person says, whoa, you just may not get into grad school because of this. This is really a problem, right? So they're dumping their cognitive distortions on you. So I like to think of this, that these can come from within and these can be dumped on us from outside. Now, we all have our go-to signature cognitive distortions. That list that I gave you is not a complete list anyway, but none of you likely saw all 6 of them and said, oh, I do that one all the time. we all sort of have our go-to cognitive distortions. And this is likely a question of both nature and nurture, meaning our biology and brain chemistry plays some role in this, but our cognitive distortions are also associated with early childhood messages and modified by experiences throughout. But when I started teaching this material, I realized just how much I catastrophize. And then I started trying to understand it, and I appreciate that I sort of grew up in a household that catastrophized a lot, right? So we get these messages from childhood, and we hold on to the distortions that we hear about. Now, when others tell us stories, the stories they tell us are driven by their cognitive distortions. So if they catastrophize, they're going to tell us a catastrophizing story. If they fall into all or nothing thinking, so we give a talk, our advisors in the audience, the honest truth is we do really well. We know we had an ouch moment or two answering a question, but you finish that talk and you feel generally proud, like you nailed it. Yeah, there's some growing, but you really nailed it. And then your advisor, all they can do is focus on that question you didn't answer well. That's because your advisor is caught in all or nothing thinking. So we tell ourselves a story, but then others tell us stories as well. Our stories are driven by our cognitive distortions. Their stories are driven by their cognitive distortions. It's also important, I'm going to go back and remind you one more time, for students of color, students who are underrepresented in an environment, around our identity. You know, we have lots of identities that we carry around with us, right? People see us, they see some of those identities, not others, but we're all aware of who we are and what our identities are. And if stereotype threat comes into play around some of our identities, that can really drive minimizing, and that drives imposter fears. So we have sort of a double whammy there of we're new, we're learning, there's all kinds of reasons to feel like we don't belong, and then stereotype threat sort of piles on. And furthermore, stereotype threat comes from inside, but stereotypes come from outside, and bias and people behaving based on stereotype, whether that's conscious or unconscious, can also drive the stories people tell us about us. And so this is cognitive distortions and imposter fears are an internal threat, but they are also an external threat, meaning that they can come from inside or from outside. And so I think we really need to ask about, so what do they do to us, right? Okay, so these exist and this happens, what does it do to us? So I want to start by pointing out that if you think about it at times, and if really in small doses, right, these distortions could motivate us to work hard and to use resources to thrive. So if I struggled in my qualifying exam and have to retake it, and I catastrophize a little bit, right? Well, I didn't do so well the last time, and that could happen again, and I don't want that to happen, right? In small doses and really delivered calmly, that could motivate me to work harder and to use resources to thrive, right? I'll go talk to my advisor. I'll go to my friends and say, will you give me a practice session? I'll get onto a good routine of sleep and exercise and eating so that I feel well when the exam happens. At times and in small doses, this could be helpful. The thing is that we hear these a lot, and when they are unchecked and unquestioned at all, when they get louder and louder and louder, they can really hold us back, they can add to our struggle, and they lead many of us to self-sabotaging behavior. So we really, really need to know what I mean by self-sabotaging behavior. So if you avoid asking questions when you really need to ask something, or you avoid talking with people who could help that you really need to talk to, or you avoid applying to schools, positions, fellowships, and awards, you avoid volunteering for assignments, you avoid volunteering for leadership positions, That's the result of self-sabotage, right? Because if we don't ask for help, we don't get help. If we don't apply to things, we don't have those opportunities. And if we don't put ourselves out there for assignments, for leadership positions, for opportunities, then there's no growth and learning. That's all self-sabotaging behavior. Self-sabotaging behavior also can lead to us withdrawing from the community and using unhealthy behaviors to try and feel better. And this can become a really negative cycle. So it leads to poor outcome in school, internships, work, and life. That negative outcome leads us to feel worse about ourselves, which leads to more self-sabotaging behavior, which leads to more negative outcomes. And so we all really want to make sure that we understand our cognitive distortions, that we recognize them, that we work to make sure to soften them. When we feel like an imposter, we want to be able to take a deep breath and talk ourselves through it. Because if not, if we ignore all of this, it can eventually lead to self-sabotaging behavior. And so in leading towards this last part of the talk, where I'm going to sort of point out some thoughts about how we do that, I want to remind you of something from last week. And I'm going to teach you a little fact. So remember, I talked about the giraffe having the largest heart in the mammalian kingdom. And I actually decided I would figure out how big the giraffe heart is. So I went to the San Diego Zoo website, 2 feet tall, 25 pounds or so, the largest heart in the kingdom. So we can talk to ourselves in a kind, big-hearted way, like a giraffe, or we can talk to ourselves in a negative, aggressive way, like a jackal. And I know in getting some feedback from the small groups that you all talked quite a bit about jackal and giraffe. And so I just want to remind you that we can come at these cognitive distortions and imposter fears like a jackal or like a giraffe. So we can't even beat ourselves up about having these, right? Because now we understand where they come from, and they're a part of the learning experience, right? They're a part of living and learning. So we have to come at this from a jackal way. So the rest of this talk, I just want you to keep in mind, right, that we really want to be a giraffe. I think I might have said we want to come at this in a jackal way. I meant to say in a giraffe way. I'm a little worried that came out wrong. All right, we really want to focus giraffe, giraffe, giraffe. All right, so if you're like me, you'll go ahead and buy a giraffe. I have all kinds of giraffes in my office, here at home, in my office at work, lots of pictures of giraffes all around. We want to channel our inner giraffe, or our big-hearted approach to solving these and understanding them. So let's talk about some strategies then for finding our giraffe, or let's flip it and say strategies for exploring our inner jackal, or all those cognitive distortions and imposter fears. And it starts by first appreciating that these stories are a part of the human experience, student experience, the lifelong learner experience. That means you appreciate that you're learning this material not just for now, but for forever. That imposter fears get in the way of people who are very senior, who have accomplished a lot, where you might think, what do you mean that this imposter fear gets in your way? How could that possibly be? It's just a part of being human, is to doubt ourselves. You want to start, first is appreciation, and second is education. And so I just gave you some links to some YouTube videos and a really great website called The Greater Good that you can start playing with to learn this material. So you can watch some of them. You can find resources on your own by Googling them. So the first strategy is to learn about them. The second group of strategies, one is to journal about them. And I got some great feedback from many of you who emailed me and said that you had started journaling. And that was pretty exciting for me to hear. Actually, the last lecture pushed me to go back and do some journaling around the pandemic. And how I'm feeling about things moving into the summer. So it's really helpful. So your emails motivated me, and I appreciate that. So you should use some journaling this week. So you should journal about cognitive distortions and imposter fears. I didn't give you an exact prompt, but you can just start with when Dr. Mogum started that list, I felt, right? Or today in this webinar, I learned. And you can do one really fun thing, keep a jackal giraffe log this week. So pay attention to your inner thoughts. Pay attention to, when something doesn't quite go your way, what's the first thing you tell yourself? And just keep a log of how much do you jackal and how can you giraffe. I think it can be really, really informative. You also should talk about this material, cognitive distortions and imposter fears, and you want to talk about it with family, with friends, with colleagues, with mentors, but you want to find giraffes to talk with, all right? If somebody is just jackaling down on you, you don't need to have the conversation with them. Find supportive people. Remember that resilience is people plus practice, but it's positive people. It's people that build you up, not people who tear you down. And I promise that we'll have a group with a positive outlook and positive discussion when we meet next week. So the skills development groups will meet next Wednesday at 1 o'clock and at 3 o'clock. For some people, we understand this material and we find strategies on our own that largely work, right? Not to say it's ever perfect. Sometimes we get caught in our inner jackal, but we generally have ways of softening the jackal and bringing up the giraffe. But sometimes we've had experiences and messaging that really makes that hard. And we find that these cognitive distortions really get in the way. And if that's the case, you want to find a counselor so you can explore why and you can learn skills for dealing with them. And that can be a really important thing to do. If you find yourself listening to this and thinking, me, and I don't really see a way of changing that, then you want to reach out to a counselor and talk to them. That's obviously easier during the school year. Hopefully we'll all be back on campus. You can stop into the counseling center at school, but you can also find counselors in the community, and it's a good idea to reach out for support if you think that that would be helpful. I want to go through some strategies that we can all use as we talk about how to deal with these. And I want to go back to that great triangle, right, where our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors are all playing in with each other. So here's the thought. I can't believe I got a C on that exam. I'll probably do just as poorly on my other midterms. My GPA will be ruined. I'm so dumb. I'll never get into grad school now. That's pretty good jackal, huh? The thing is that those negative thoughts, and there are many cognitive distortions within that short little story that this person told, those negative thoughts are going to lead toward all kinds of negative feelings, like panic, like stress, like worry, embarrassment, shame maybe, anger, feelings of being overwhelmed, distracted, sad, resigned, hopeless. And that can lead to really unhelpful behaviors, like I can't concentrate, I skip study groups, I ignore office hours, I watch TV instead of studying, I stay up late playing video games because I feel lousy. So our negative thoughts drive negative feelings and negative behaviors. And what you want to do to deal with that is spelled out in this helpful acronym, HATS. So you want to hear your negative self-talk. You want to actually hear all of the irrational thoughts in there, right? I'll probably do just as poorly on the other ones. My GPA will be ruined. I'm dumb. I won't get in. You want to hear. H is for hear. Then you want to appreciate actually that you have a choice. You can buy into all of that, not question it, assume the worst. You have the choice to do that. but you also have a choice to pause and say, let me hold on here. Let me question that. That leads to the T in HATS, or talking back. And you want to channel your inner giraffe to talk back. Now, I think it's also important to talk back like a realistic giraffe, right? I don't think we should just say, C, no big deal, okay, I got a C, oh well, because if it's a class that matters to us, we want to get a B on the next exam or an A on the next exam. So we don't want to just say everything will be fine, don't worry, let it go. We want to actually talk back like a realistic giraffe. I'm going to have to make some changes maybe in how I study. I'm going to have to think this through. I'm going to have to talk to the teacher. I'm going to have to figure out what I don't know. But we want to talk back like a realistic giraffe. Now, sometimes that's all we need to do, but often we then need to seek help and access resources. Sometimes in the moment we lose self-confidence. So we're at a poster session talking about our summer project, and we're doing great, and then we stumble and we have a minute, and suddenly we're hearing all this negative self-talk. I can't believe you couldn't answer that question. So stupid. I can't believe that. I'm not going to get to come back next summer. You know, at that point, we just have to hear it, appreciate we have a choice, and talk ourselves down. We don't need to run out of the poster session to seek help and access resources. Often we just need to center ourselves. However, maybe in that moment we realize, wait a minute, I'm really feeling lousy, and my friend is right there across the aisle, and we say, hey, this can be tough, huh? Even that small seeking help can make a big difference. So sometimes it's HAT and sometimes it's HATS, but you want to keep that acronym in mind. And here's how it would work. So the thought then would be, boy, that C was disappointing. I studied hard and I thought I would do better. Maybe I need to rethink how I'm studying. I'm going to sit down here for a moment and think this through. And you might come up with slightly different language, but notice how much kinder that is. Now, just that kinder giraffe thinking can lead to some feelings that are more positive, like hopeful, motivated, focused. And you know what? We can still be worried, stressed, embarrassed, and disappointed. But suddenly we have a way through this, right? We're going to put our problem-solving skills to play to work through this. So yeah, our feelings might still be, there might be still some negative feelings there, but there's also some positive feelings. And that can lead to changes in behavior. Like maybe we reevaluate our study strategy. Maybe we reach out for support. Maybe we look at our study schedule and say it was completely unrealistic. Actually, I didn't get through everything till the night before, so now I have to rethink my study schedule for the next exams. Maybe we're going to actually text our friends and say, I just can't Zoom with you tonight. Or hopefully in the future, I can't come out with you tonight. I realize I'm behind. Maybe it leads to the behavior that we realize we still have all this stress, embarrassment, and disappointment. So we go to exercise to deal with some of that frustration and disappointment. We change our thoughts. That helps us change our feelings and behaviors. And we have a much better chance of moving forward positively. So that's HATS. Hear it, appreciate, you have a choice, talk back, and seek resources. So in the moment, to hear, you really, really need to take a deep breath. Often our mind is racing in the middle of those thoughts. As you journal, pay attention to what comes along with those thoughts, and hopefully you can find a way to interrupt them. For me, it's a deep breath, a pause, and a stretch. So a really deep, mindful breath. I notice that my jaw is clenched. I notice that I'm sweating. I notice that my thoughts are really racing. Right? Those are three signatures to me that I'm caught in a catastrophizing moment. Then you want to acknowledge them, keeping in mind your inner giraffe, which I already talked about. But now I want to give you another tool, and that's your inner scientist. So all of you are interested in science in some way. That's why you're hanging out with us. So what do scientists do? They ask for the evidence. Scientists love to ask questions. They say, how likely is it? Is there another hypothesis? What do I really know about this? So you texted your friends to come to study with you and you didn't get an answer, and your mind reading self is running away in a story of they're studying without you, you're the weak link in the group, they don't want to study with you, they're ignoring you, that's why they're not answering. And you can say, well, why else might they have not answered? Oh, like maybe they're busy, maybe they're in a webinar. How likely is it that they don't want to study with me because they wanted to study with me last week, right? So you got your inner giraffe and you got your inner scientist. And those are two really powerful anecdotes to this. Okay, these are ways to work with your cognitive distortions and imposter fears. Now, I find something else that a lot of students have pointed out to me as they've been working on this material, and that is that they often find inspiration from something. It can be a picture, it can be a positive affirmation, it can be an image in their mind that makes them feel strong, but very, very often we have a go-to sort of touchstone that helps us find our inner strength and our inner giraffe. And so think about what that might be for you. I don't know, a long time ago, somebody said to me, it is what it is. And I don't know why that seems so novel and unique to me, but it really did. At the moment, it's like, well, here's where things are at. All right, so let me calm down and just sit there for a moment. So for me, it is what it is an incredibly calming phrase. Each of you can find a calming phrase, a calming image in your head. All right, so all of those things together give us a chance of controlling these cognitive distortions in the moment. The other thing I think is we just want to practice. And so I couldn't figure out how to make those voice bubbles in cartoons. So I used clouds instead. But you know, you're sitting somewhere and you realize imposter fears are getting in the way. You're in class and the teacher is going on and on. He's like, oh, this is really complicated material. You know, hold on tight, right? They think they're being funny at the start when we say stuff like that all the time, right? For you, you weren't feeling that great about the material anyway, or maybe you were feeling really great, but they said that and they went, well, maybe he's talking to me. Maybe she's thinking some of us don't belong here. That's probably me. And then you get into this imposter fear cycle. So you want to talk back, right? At least 70% of all people feel like an imposter at some point. This is a common part of the new student experience. I'm not alone. Or imposter fears again, understandable but not helpful. Who can I talk with to get some support? So you want to start talking back. And I don't know that you really want to talk out loud, but quite frankly, if that helps, talk out loud. Something that really works, a hack that works for me, that a lot of students have said also works for them, is just asking this question: are these thoughts helping me or hurting me? So if you're sitting in class and you're in the imposter fear train and you're not paying attention and you have a question, but you can't even focus on it because you're so wrapped up on ruminating on your imposter fears, you could just interrupt them with, so are these thoughts helping or hurting? Well, they're not helping because I'm not listening. They're not helping because I won't ask my question because of them. They're hurting me. So maybe I'll put them aside for right now. I personally find this hack works for actions as well. Right, so if I get into a really stress response, and one of my ways of dealing with stress is to avoid by searching things on the internet, and I'll read 6 articles on the same topic. It sort of just fills time and somehow makes me feel like I'm productive, even though I'm not reading about the thing I need to be reading about. And I'll ask myself, so is all this surfing the internet helping or hurting? And then I realize, well, I'm not moving. I could be using this time outdoors. I could be using it for work. I could be using it to feel better. It's hurting me. So that's a hack that I think really works for both thoughts and actions. That's a slide I didn't get actually to make yet. So the next time I deliver this, there'll be one more slide. And then I wanted to teach another strategy that I really love. And it's called appreciative inquiry. And it comes out of the work of David Cooper Ryder. And appreciative inquiry is actually a tool that we can use for ourselves or as a group or as an organization to look at change. And it focuses us to start on what is working and to use that as a foundation for future development. So when I get really, really caught in negative thoughts, I like to try to slow them down by saying, well, what part did go well here? Or when, and I haven't taken a class in a long time, but I still write grants and I get some and I don't get some. And so when I get negative feedback about a grant application, I first say, well, what did they like, right? What went well? Why did it go well, right? I'll be like, well, what have I learned since the last situation like this, right? So I've written lots of grants that haven't gotten funded, and I've learned from some of them that reaching out and asking for feedback helps. I've learned from others that reading the reviews the next day instead of right in the moment helps. So it slows you down to ask yourself questions about what went well. Okay, now what didn't go so well? Like eventually we want to get to that part of what, you know, what disappointment, what can I do about this one? Two other questions, if I wasn't afraid, what would I do now? Almost always I find that leads to I would talk to someone else about this. And maybe it isn't, I'm afraid, it's if I wasn't embarrassed or ashamed, what would I do now? I would reach out for support. I would go to the teacher and say, I'm surprised I got a C. Or I would call the person who didn't give me the money and say, can you give me some feedback, why? And then what are the opportunities for growth and learning? Those questions slow down the negative process and re-engage your problem solving. Once you re-engage your problem solving, it's easier to let go of the cognitive distortions. So this is another strategy that I like to really use. And somehow I ended up here with the wrong slide deck. And so I'm going to try to find the right slide deck right now. Because what I wanted to do was end with a story. So let's see. Yeah. Actually, before that, I want to do one other thing. Sorry about that, guys. So I talked a lot about strategies for when the imposter fears and cognitive distortions come from within. But remember, I pointed out that they also can come from others, right? So people can tell us that we don't belong, right? People can tell us that we're not going to get into the program we applied to. So people can bring cognitive distortions to the table for us. Generally, I think that workplace culture often triggers cycles of distortions and imposter syndrome. So it didn't start internal, it started external, but that triggers a cycle for us. Someone says, students with this grade never end up in medical school, or if you're struggling in this class, you're really going to struggle in this higher level class, right? And that triggers a cycle of distortions and imposter fears for us. Now, that it takes a lot more training to, you know, and discussion on this topic. And in fact, we're going to talk about assertiveness and feedback resilience and finding mentors, and all of those 3 webinars coming up will explore the important parts of this. But I just want to point out that even when the imposter fears or cognitive distortion comes from outside, from others, HATS still holds. So you can hear the jackal, hear the distortions for what they are. You can still appreciate that you have a choice to listen or not, right? One person saying students who do poorly in this class never get to medical school or never get internships, right? That's like, you know, is that really valid? What do they know? Are they absolute experts? And, you know, isn't that sort of exaggerated? So you have a choice to listen. You also actually have a choice to talk to them about what they said or not, right? You can say, why would you say that? Or you can decide, this person's not helpful to me right now. They're not a part of my resilience strategy. They're right now anti-resilient, and I'm going to disengage. That's the A. The T is talk back. Even if only to yourself, you can talk back. So you have the ability to use those tools we just talked about to say, this is one person's opinion. And yes, maybe they're an important person right now, but they are not the only person. And that leads to S, which is seek resources and community. When the imposter fears and distortions are being dumped on us by others, I think it is extremely important to talk about that with mentors and with peers. So I think in that case, when you feel like the imposter fears and the distortions are coming at you from others, I think it's critically important to find community and resources for dealing with it. And so I'm glad I found the right slide deck, because these are important slides that I didn't want to miss. And I wanted to end with a story and actually some homework. So I'm going to actually tell you a story of my own. And actually, I think as you hear it, you might say she's making this all up, but it is absolutely a true story. And I don't know if you ever read the book when you were little, Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. I did not read it when I was little, but I have lots of nieces and nephews who are little, and I get to read that story quite a number of times. So I'm going to tell you a story instead, The New Student and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. But I need to teach you a tiny little bit of science first, okay? So in my first rotation of grad school, second rotation of grad school, I was studying a really large protein, a molecular motor called dynein, that actually makes sperm swim. I was studying dynein in sea urchin sperm. So we would isolate sea urchin sperm, burst them open, and pull out the proteins that make up the motor that make the sperm swim. And some dynein subunits are huge, like 400,000 kilodaltons. And some are tiny, like 4,000 or 10,000 kilodaltons. So I needed to run gels, protein gels, that would allow me to see really big proteins and really small proteins. And so here on the slide, I'm going to turn on the camera to help a little bit. What you can see is you have two solutions, a really dense solution and a less dense solution, and they mix together in a tube, and that tube leads into between two plates, and you can pour a gel. And in that protein gel at the top are really large proteins, and at the bottom are really small proteins. So it is this strategy for studying multi-protein complexes where some are really large and can't migrate through the gel, and some are really small, so they migrate quickly through the gel. Okay, so and if you don't know how protein gels work, you can Google that and it'll be a chance to learn. But hopefully this is enough to understand the story. Now in A, there's a catalyst, so that when the two liquids come together, the gel will slowly move through that tube and catalyze. The reaction is catalyzed and it polymerizes. Okay, so once it polymerizes, it becomes actually a gel, not two liquids. So I worked in this lab. My advisor's name was Win. It was like the second day of my rotation in his group. I had done a summer rotation, but this was the start of grad school, really. And I had to make one of these, what we call gradient gels. So Win and I worked and we isolated the dyneins out of the gel, out of the proteins. We isolated the dyneins out of the sperm. We had this protein preparation, and I had to pour the gel. And Win left me alone for like 15 minutes to figure out all my calculations for the catalyst and for the acrylamide, what was going to go into A and what was going to go into B. And I got all ready, and he came back and said, "Are you all good to go? Do you need anything?" And I said, "Good to go. I'm all fine." And I had in my pipette the chemical that would start to catalyze the reaction. So I open it up, so A and B are moving, and I drop in the, I can't remember the name of the chemical right now, but I drop in the catalyst, and my math was off by an entire log unit. Okay, so I had 1,000 times too much catalyst in there. So this is an exothermic reaction, meaning it gives off a huge amount of heat. And when you have 1,000 times too much, it catalyzes instantly, it generates a huge amount of heat. That tube popped, and polymerized acrylamide went everywhere. It flew in the air, okay? It flew all the way towards the door where Wynn had just come back to see how things were going. And Wynn, even then, this is a long time ago, but even then, Wynn was bald, and I swear that there was a bit of acrylamide on his shiny bald head. That maybe I'm wrong about, but I swear there was acrylamide everywhere. And I thought grad school is over. I thought I had messed up so bad. I thought Wynn was going to say, get out of here. I thought nobody else was ever going to take me for a rotation. I thought grad school was done. All right. So that is my horrible, terrible, no good, very bad day. Now, here I am. I finished grad school, so I think we can assume things went okay. But here's the story that I told myself about that. All right. And what I'm going to ask you to do is take this story and work with it over the next week. All right. So day 2 in Wynn's lab, a few weeks into my first year of grad school, the worst day ever. Nothing went right. I'm so stupid. I got confused making up solutions. I always knew I was not good in math. I have quite a fixed mindset about math even to this day, just as an aside to the story. I thought I calculated a 1 millimolar stock, but it was really 1 molar. So I added too much catalyst into my gel. And like I told you, the minute I squirted it in, it heated up like crazy. The solution bubbled over, the tubing started expanding, it popped, the gel polymerized, sticky gel everywhere. Okay. I could tell that Wynn was really mad at me. I knew he wished I never joined his lab. Everything is totally ruined. Everyone else knows how to do this. Why don't I? I know everyone is laughing at me now, and I'm wondering why they accepted me as a grad student. I totally blew my chance to stay in Wynn's lab, and nobody else will let me work in their lab once they hear about this. So now what am I going to do? I'm not cut out for grad school. And this actually, I mean, it's a lot of years later, and I still remember actually feeling that negative about the whole thing. So your job, actually, over the course of this week, as you explore cognitive distortions, and as you explore imposter fears, and as you pay attention to jackal language, your job is to take a look at this and find all the cognitive distortions you can and help me rewrite that story. And while we won't go over line by line in the small groups next week, we'll sort of launch from here, okay? Just this idea that one thing can happen negative that can just launch us down this huge path of catastrophizing negativity, right? And it can be totally demotivating, all right? And so this was a story of mine early in grad school. I imagine all of you have stories just like this. And the honest truth is, if you want to think about your story and find your cognitive distortions, that would be a great use of your time as well. But I want you to help this disheartened graduate student by rewriting that story or spending some time on it. When you get a chance right after, I'd love for you to watch this. This is a tape of Maya Angelou reciting her poem, Still I Rise. And I talked about finding strength from others, finding things that can motivate us when we really feel down. And I wanted to share this because I think for many, many students, this poem, Still I Rise, is one of those motivating things. And so I encourage you to take a moment to watch this. So we're going to go ahead and look some at the questions, and I'm going to go ahead and answer as many as I can. There are lots of questions about accessing the recording after the session. It will be on YouTube within a few days. You can find it there, but in the short term, you can find it at the exact same link, okay? I'm from Puerto Rico, and every time I apply to a program, everyone around me says that I'll get in because many programs look for diversity. This makes me feel like I get picked more because of my background rather than my qualifications. How can we overcome these emotions? Thank you. You're not the first student who has shared that. In fact, in a workshop I did in person a couple summers ago, a student stood up and said, after I got into the graduate summer research program at NIH, somebody said, oh, they just needed diversity, so they picked you. First of all, let me just acknowledge how harmful it is for people to say that. And I'm sorry that people say that, because the honest truth is that competitive programs have lots of applicants. And we look at every element of an application. And yes, it is our responsibility to make science accessible to all and welcoming to all. And we want our programs to be diverse because the world is diverse and you all bring different perspectives and we need those perspectives. So yes, diversity can be an element, and it is often an element in the selection process, but it is never the only element of a selection process. And what you should say is, I'm sure that the organizers were looking at the sum total of what I bring to the table. And some of what I bring comes from my diversity, and some of what I bring comes from my love of genetics, or my ability to lead groups, or the volunteer work that I've done. And so you need to actually use your science voice and say, what evidence is there that that's true? And the honest truth is, as somebody who's on the missions committee, is it is not. It is never just one factor. Is there a link for the discussion next Wednesday? It will come in email this in the next day or two. Would you say expectations are a type of distortion that, based off the way a situation is going and using your logic of predicting what is likely to happen, that when we form expectations, it's a form of distortion? That's actually an interesting question. And if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're asking is, if I envision something happening a certain way, is that a distortion? And I would say that it depends. If you are envisioning that it's going to turn out negatively without any data, then it is a cognitive distortion for sure. If you are envisioning that it's going to be fabulous, right? I'm absolutely going to get that. I'm going to get in for sure. Then I think it's also distortion. But if you start out and have an expectation, this will be hard, there'll be bumps, there'll be ups and downs, then I think it might be a little bit of a reality check. So I think it depends on what story you're telling yourself about that outcome. How do you know when you're overreacting and when you're reacting in a normal way? How do you know if the school position fellowship that you're applying for is appropriate? What if you don't? What if you don't have high achievements? What if you overestimate yourself? So I think the question here has a lot of parts, but if I understand correctly, you're saying, well, so maybe I tell myself I'm not good enough, and maybe I'm really not good enough. And how do I know? Maybe I don't have enough achievement to apply for this fellowship, or maybe my grades aren't as good as they need to be to get into this certain school or program. So the honest truth is that we never know completely in isolation. And one of the reasons why this series ends with me talking about mentorship is because that's how we know. We find people to guide us and support us through making decisions like that. We read websites and eligibility criteria, but we don't want to read them really narrowly and negatively, right? We want to read them realistically. So our website says, we're interested in candidates that have a 3.2 or higher. However, candidates with a lower GPA who show that they're continuing to improve, please apply. And I've had many people tell me, oh, you don't mean that. You just say that, but you don't mean that. And the honest truth is I do mean that, right? Our application says that because we mean it. So you decide by reading the eligibility, but you read it with a really open mind and a positive view. You talk to mentors and say, am I reaching here? Am I reaching too far? You know, when we want to apply for things that are a reach. If we never take risks, we never get the reward of those risks. And so the way we do that is by questioning. So, I mean, that was a beautiful question. How do you know when you're overreacting? I think what you might need to say to yourself is, I want to pause for a moment. Am I overreacting here? Or am I undervaluing myself here? Well, let me think it through and let me seek support from others in that. Mentors help us decide that. Our friends and supporters can be listening sounding boards for things like that. And we learn how to look realistically at our accomplishments, how to look realistically at our gaps, right? We learn to look at our GPA and our scores and our internships and put them into perspective. But it takes help. Still I Rise is my favorite poem. Yeah, it's really lovely. I watch this pretty often, sometimes in a room full of people, and it can be so emotional to watch it in a group. So I hope that you all enjoy it. How do I effectively communicate my imposter fears to my PI? I think that's a really great question, because if we don't tell people where we are at and how we're feeling, they can't help us. On the other hand, we want to only share if it's safe. So the first question is, you have to ask yourself, is your PI the kind of person that you would feel comfortable sharing that with? And then you have to ask yourself, why am I sharing that? Right? And if the answer is, so she can support me a little bit more, so that she can give me more feedback, so that she can give me a day to decide if I want to apply, right? Then you have a really clear reason for sharing. And you can ask to talk and say, I want to talk about some things holding me back from being successful here in your group, and then move forward to share. And next week, I think, well, next week is a small group, and right after that, we're going to do assertiveness and self-advocacy, and that will be about how do you share, right? And I think it's the first thing is to ask, why am I sharing? And is it safe to share, especially within a hierarchy? All right, so hopefully that answered your question. This might be a touch personal, and I can feel free not to answer it, but has your experience as a queer woman in the sciences contributed to imposter fears? Actually, I would say that my experience, and actually tomorrow as part of Pride at NIH, I will be doing a Twitter chat with the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion about being queer at NIH. So I would say within the educational space, not so much. Although I hid for many, many decades. I didn't come out till I was pretty old, actually. But I don't think it contributed so much to imposter fears. But in life, around family and around being a parent and around stepping up into leadership roles in the community, I think it played a big role. And I would be happy to answer some questions about that tomorrow at the Twitter chat. How do we deal with self-sabotage and stop it? So first of all, I think the minute we appreciate that our behaviors can change our thoughts and our thoughts can change our feelings and behaviors, you know, the more we appreciate the interplay of those, the better off we are. But I think the easiest way to stop self-sabotage, at least for me, is that mindful pause so that we can acknowledge that we're self-sabotaging, followed by a small change in behavior. Whether that be that we go and talk to somebody and say, I am procrastinating and I really need some support. Or we say, I haven't exercised and I'm feeling down, and exercise makes me feel better, so let me try that. I think we pause and notice the self-sabotaging behavior, and then we try to do something to impact it or soften it. I think when it is a really negative self-sabotaging behavior, a harmful one, we want to seek support and guidance very, very quickly. We want to reach out to experts to talk about it, right? A lot of addictive behaviors are really self-sabotaging ways of ignoring what's going on for us. That's really painful. And so we want to notice it, pause, be kind to ourselves, and take some actions. And often those actions should involve reaching out for support. I'm a career changer going from liberal arts to pre-med. I'm struggling with imposter fears because of my lack of science background, with the exception of NIH, of course. I was in a great lab last summer. Our research was successful, but I still feel like a fake. How can career changers specifically change imposter fears? So I think one thing about imposter fears is we have to remind ourselves of our successes, and success is transferable, right? If we learn to problem solve in one field, we will learn to problem solve in another. If we learn to build relationships effectively in one area of our life, we can learn to build them effectively in another. So I think a way to address imposter fears in everyone is to look at our previous successes, but in career changers, especially to look at previous successes, right? Because you have already a record of success. Another thing in all of this is to say, well, of course I feel like an imposter. Like, it makes so much sense. I've been in science and medicine like, 20 weeks, and some people that I'm interacting with, it's like 20 years. So some of this is the new learner experience that totally makes sense. And so I think we have to acknowledge that it makes sense, and then say, but let me remind myself of evidence of when I was able to succeed. Often postdocs in my lab say that their PhD from the EU is better than a PhD from the United States. I think they're just projecting their own imposter fears, but how can I deal with this? I really think this is a great example, and I don't know why they say that, right? I'm not going to guess why. You have a hypothesis, right? And it could be absolutely correct. Well, I'm going to ignore that part and focus on has. So that's somebody jackling on you because you're working hard in your PhD and it's the one you're in, and right, this is an important process for you. So they're really jackling on you. So I think you have to appreciate. You hear it, appreciate that this is not helpful to you, that it's not like one system of PhD is better than the other. They are both just systems. People come out with different skills, different backgrounds. We can be in the same system and have a different experience. I think the answer to this one is to appreciate that that's not helpful to you. And you can either say, hey guys, it's not helpful, whatever you think, but this isn't helpful to me. I appreciate if you didn't bring it up. Or you could just tell yourself, this isn't helpful and I'm not gonna take it in. I think this is a real time to appreciate you have a choice and you don't wanna hear that. I think that's a really, really key element in that one. Why are human instincts for survival, why do they cause such bad cognitive distortions and imposter fears? I think that if you think about it, if we didn't respond to, evolutionarily, we could either be lunch or eat lunch, right? We lived in really unsafe conditions without security and housing. The individuals were really at risk. And so our brain needed to make sure we stayed safe by causing us to respond to all risks in a very big way. And over time, that system is still there. The problem is that our frontal lobe, which needs to calm that alert system, doesn't always engage well. So there's this whole field, if you want to do some reading over the summer, for those of you still at home because of the pandemic, look at emotional intelligence. That's our ability to know how we feel and to manage those feelings. It's our ability to respond to stress instead of reacting in a big aggressive way. But evolutionarily, it makes sense that cognitive distortions and imposter fears exist. It's just that when they grow unchecked, that they become dangerous. Is it a jackal-like mindset to view negative setbacks as humbling experiences instead of as motivators to work harder? I think that I don't think that it's an, negative setbacks are humbling, right? I mean, they remind us that we make mistakes. They remind us that we don't know everything. I think actually it's a pretty reasonable thing to see negative setback as a humbling experience. But I think it's also helpful if it's in the educational setting to try to find the growth mindset in it and use it as a motivator to work hard. But I wouldn't say that I see that as especially as a jackal-like mindset. If you, are too hard on yourself, that's really the issue. Re-expectations as a cognitive distortion. I'm going to my second year and I struggle with this a lot. I set unrealistically high expectations for myself for someone just entering a new space. And when I fail to meet those expectations, it becomes, oh, I can't make my expectations. I'm not where I want to be. I'm an imposter. They'll realize, yeah, that's a really, really common negative cycle. We set extremely high, unrealistic expectations, right? Then we don't meet them, of course, because they're too high. And then we use them in a self-sabotaging way to hold ourselves down even more. And so what you need to do in that is find the place to break that cycle for you. So maybe every time you set expectations now, you can find your science mindset, your science voice, and say, so are these realistic expectations for a first year post-bac? Maybe they're not. Okay, can I adjust them a little bit? The other thing, I think one of the things that frustrates me about the trainees here at NIH, not about them, but something about the system, is we all know that if we talk about how hard all of this is in a positive, safe space, that we'll realize we're not alone. We hear strategies, we build connections. And I think it's important that you choose some preventative maintenance for this, right? So go to the resilience discussion group on imposter fears, which we hold, I think, probably once a month or maybe every other week. Make sure to find some friends and talk about this. Journal about it so that you start to recognize, oh, I'm setting unrealistic expectations. That's driving imposter fears. That makes me really feel insecure, right? Wherever you have awareness, you can choose a behavior to intervene. If you're making a big change to your life path, change of major, change of career, how can you tell the difference between cognitive distortions and general signs that your new path isn't right for you? So again, I think that that is a lot of self-awareness and questioning and journaling. You're right. Sometimes we say, oh, I'm gonna do this or be this or study that, and then we realize, no, not for me. But sometimes it's just a little cognitive distortion and imposter fear getting in the way. So the way we deal with that is when we notice those doubts, we pause again, we take a deep breath, we slow down, and we sit with them and we talk about them with people that we trust, we journal about them, we revisit them, and we see over time, do they change? And usually that helps us make a decision. A lot of times when I work with trainees who are thinking, should I change labs or not? Or do I really want to go to grad school? I thought I did, but now I'm not so sure. I realize that what they need is time for them to journal and think and reflect, time to talk, a chance to say things out loud in a bigger group, right? To sort of try things on. And so that's how I think we figure that out. by giving ourselves the time and space to explore those questions. How do you know when you're being humble or modest and when you're feeling imposter fears? You know, a lot of people, when we talk in depth about imposter fears in small groups, we'll talk about the fact that one good thing about imposter fears is that they make us feel humble and we don't brag as much. And in many cultures, we get a message that bragging is really negative, right? Don't brag, don't call attention to yourself. Especially in collectivist cultures or interdependent cultures, we get a message about our role is to support the group, not to sort of stand out on our own. And so this can be this feeling of, wait a minute, I'm supposed to feel this way. I got these messages that I shouldn't brag, I shouldn't focus on my accomplishments. And those are beautiful messages and they serve us well in many ways. But we always have to ask ourselves, how do we need to modify those messages to support our growth as we move on? And we will never get a job or into a school if we can't talk about what we're good at. We will never grow in our profession if we're not able to point out what we've already accomplished so that we can take on a new task. And so we want to appreciate that being humble is a positive thing, right? But too much humility is not so positive. Strengths overused become liabilities. Keep that in mind. And so sometimes students point out that the way they deal with that is they remind themselves, if I'm so humble and I don't speak up about what I know, then I'm not sharing my thoughts with others and I'm hurting others. So I'm going to speak up to help the group. How to distinguish imposter fears from humility is to really pause for yourself and ask yourself, where does this feeling of not speaking up or not talking about my accomplishments or not believing that I can do this, where does it come from? And you know, it doesn't really matter if it comes from a message about humility or it comes from imposter fears. If it's holding you back, it's holding you back. So I hope that helps. In light of the fundamental attribution error, it's difficult to think others will realize there could be an environmental reason for our mistakes or failures. How do we tell ourselves that others won't blame us when it's very possible they are blaming us? And you're right, you know, especially when people are stressed, right now, all of us, right? We tend to think really quickly and make shortcuts, and we often don't pause to say, is there another explanation for this, right? So you know, the honest truth is others might blame you, right? Or others might think you messed up. And you have to decide, so do I need to correct that? Do I need to explain? Do I need to talk with them? Or does it really not matter, right? Sometimes people attribute a reason to a behavior and I just decide it's not that important for me to correct them right now. And sometimes I feel like it's really important for me to say, can I explain what actually did happen? And so again, I think maybe the answer, I'm starting to feel like a broken record, maybe the answer to everything is we pause and we use that science voice to say, so what's my first impression of this situation? What are some alternate hypotheses here to explain what's going on? How important is this to me? What can I do about it? And so I think that we really want to learn a way of sort of engaging with our suppositions that's positive and helps us work through them. I'm often the youngest person in my cohort. My question is, what are some tips to help combat imposter fears with something that I cannot control? You know, at the start of the pandemic, one of our wellness advisors did a webinar on stress management, and she said, there are things we can't control, and there are things we can't control, but we really wish to control them. And the way to deal with the stress of that is to focus on what we can control. So you're right, you can't change your age and you can't change the age of the other people in the cohort, but you can control how you interact with them. You can control being engaged in groups. You can control smiling, reaching out, talking to people. You can control taking a deep breath and answering a question about your age if they ask it. You can control how you wish to talk to people if they bring it up. So the way we control our stresses around things we can't control is to appreciate we can't control that and focus on what we can control. How do we develop relationships that we can feel comfortable sharing with? I feel right now like I have no relationships where I can be vulnerable. And I think that that is a really honest and actually very vulnerable comment to make. You know, I think that sometimes we're in environments that are so competitive that we feel we can't let our guard down. I think that at work, sometimes we're so worried about being ourselves that we hide big parts of ourselves, and then it makes it harder to be vulnerable and share. So what we do is we seek out groups where that's possible. In college, that could be clubs. At NIH, it could be some of the affinity groups or some of the post-bac or grad student activities. In the community, it can be supportive activities at the Y, at the community center. We find spaces that welcome us. And in those spaces, we develop relationships where we feel comfortable sharing. My hope in doing the groups every week is that we would find a space like that for each other, that we would help make that space for each other. And, you know, I know I got a lot of questions about it. It would be so nice to be in the same group. And I agree, because that does allow us to really build a safety. And maybe sometime we'll figure out the technology for how to do that. But my hope is spontaneously on Wednesday, you can build that kind of space. So being around people who are struggling with the same thing is one way of finding places where you can do this. In your school, there's a learning center. There, I'm sure, are clubs where this would be, where you could find really comfort talking about things. Another place, if we really feel alone and we really aren't comfortable sharing, that's another reason why therapy can be so important. It's a place where we can practice being vulnerable, especially guys, but I think lots of people, not just guys, get a message that you're supposed to hide all your vulnerability, right? We don't show that we're scared, worried, afraid, upset, sad. We hide all of that. And so some of us, not only do we have to find a space, but we have to find the skill set to do this. And we are kind. We channel that giraffe and we find that space. So I think that it's both allowing ourselves to be that way, developing the skills to be vulnerable that way, and finding the space. I feel that I understand imposter fears well, thanks to the discussion, but I truly am an imposter. I am not doing great in lab, and most of my fellow grad students are doing well. So in all likelihood, many of the grad students around you feel like they are not doing so well. But you're right, sometimes we realize we are not doing the right thing. This morning, I talked to a group of postdocs, and they wanted me to share my career path. And I started by saying, so I was a physical therapist, and that lasted about 18 months. And I don't know if I was an imposter exactly, but it certainly wasn't exactly the right thing for me. It wasn't what I should have been doing. And those imposter fears that I had when I was doing it probably served me well. So sometimes the message we get, maybe grad school is not your thing. Maybe grad school is, but the lab you're in isn't right. Maybe this grad school isn't right. Right? I don't know, because I hardly know you. So I mean, I don't know you at all. So I really can't figure that out. And the way we figure those things out is we're vulnerable and we ask those questions. We ask them with people who are giraffes. We find the giraffes and we talk. I don't feel like a very good grad student right now. You know, can you share perspective? What I would say to somebody, you know, is that there are grad students who finished in my lab that nothing worked for forever long time, and then wow, everything worked. And there were people where things worked early and then it seemed like they were golden and then nothing worked. My grad school experience ended with us all acknowledging this is never going to work, so we can't keep you here forever. So there's a lot underlying I'm not doing great in lab. right? And lots of reasons and possibilities and lots of places for you to explore. And journaling would be a good start. Talking to a mentor in the program would be a good start. Another good start would be to maybe ask all of your fellow grad students whether they feel great all of the time. Sometimes just asking that, we learn we're not so alone. I'm going to therapy to help unlearn my distortions, and it's been really helping me. So I want to give that affirmation to others. Thank you for sharing that. I do think that that's really helpful. Here's a question about finding mentors. How do we go about finding mentors? The last lecture in the series will be about finding mentors, but finding mentors starts with having conversations with people in our communities that we respect. So it involves reaching out to a TA who really was helpful and saying, you know, could I talk to you a little bit? It involves going to career events and reaching out to the speaker afterward, but I'll go into lots of details about that. There's some thank yous here for some people that I know and people I don't know, and you're all very, very welcome. What pushed you to keep trying after failing the exam more than once? You know, the honest truth is that a lot of people had told me I didn't belong in grad school. I had a lot of imposter fears about grad school for a variety of reasons, and I decided that I would persevere and prove some people wrong. So I didn't get into grad school the first time. And so I used a little bit of some of the negative emotion around that to motivate myself. And so I think that it was partially wanting to prove others wrong, but it also was the fact that when I paused and really asked myself, did I want to be here? The answer was really yes. That's why being able to stop and slow down all those racing thoughts and truly address the questions matters so much. So the answer was yes. So I got a tutor, I learned the material, I took the exam again, and here I am. And I had a really great career as a scientist. I loved what I did. In the end, it's so right for me. But I almost didn't go on. And so that's why we need to learn this material, because we want to stop from leaving things that are important to us for the wrong reasons. Sometimes we have to stop something. Sometimes we change paths, right? Nothing's linear. And it, you know, we're writing a story and it's constantly evolving, and that's good. But sometimes jackals get in our way, whether that be ourselves jackaling or that be others jackaling on us. And we want to learn how to figure out how to persist in those situations. I don't know how to talk back to really assertive people. I feel like they always have the upper hand and it's not worth trying. But I'm just going to start a discussion that won't go anywhere. We're going to talk a lot about assertiveness in the next session that we have together. And the honest truth is, some people are super assertive and you have to sort of match their assertiveness by sort of toning it up some. Sometimes it's not worth it. Sometimes it really is worth it. So the first question, just like the question about how do I tell my PI, the first question is it worth it for me to do this? Is there a reason why I want to talk to this person while they're being assertive? And so it depends, but all of us, there's some great communication tools that we'll be talking about next time. I feel like I will always have imposter fears from being a non-native English speaker. The fact that I will never be as good a speaker and hence a successful scientist as a native speaker really bugs me at times. I guess I would like you to consider reframing that and asking the question, how many people can speak multiple languages? How many people can leave one culture, come very far to a foreign culture, figure it out, and be successful? And maybe you could reframe it from, I have an accent and I'm not a native English speaker, so I'll never be as good, to I have an accent because I came from very far away. I adapted, I adjusted, I learned a new culture and a new language. So here I am. I have so much resilience. So reframing things can be really, really helpful. And I think that this is a case of needing to reframe. As someone who has tried to learn foreign languages, I spent a year in Israel, and you know, really at times struggled to communicate. And then years ago, I decided I wanted to learn Spanish, and I've been taking Spanish lessons off and on for a long time. So as someone who's tried, I say, wow, right? For those of you who are international and didn't speak English and came here, those of you in households where English isn't the first language, those of you who go home and translate for your parents while other people are studying, like, wow, that you can do all of that. So maybe a little bit of reframing would help. What handle will the Twitter chat be on? You know, I have absolutely no idea, but if you've thought, my Twitter is at Sharon Milgram, and the NIH one, OITE one is at NIH_OITE, and I'm sure we'll tweet it out in the morning. I only did one Twitter chat in my life. I'm not feeling that confident about it. I got some imposter fears happening here. So maybe by tomorrow I'll be feeling better about it. Even though I know that combating imposter fears, but by reminding ourselves of our successes can be effective, I have trouble accepting success as my own. How can I teach myself to acknowledge what I have done? I think you need to ask yourself why that is. And did you get a message early on that you couldn't accomplish things, that you needed help, that other people accomplished? Very often, when we pause and say, why is that, we can get some insight. The flip side of that is you could ignore why, and you could just say, every time I discount my success, I'm going to remind myself, well, that's a cognitive distortion. It's not helpful. So let me just own that success. Maybe it feels uncomfortable, but it's still mine. So I think you have two things. One is to explore why and then work on change. The other is to work on change. They're not mutually exclusive. You can do both of those. But I think that, you know, the fact that you're aware of that allows you to just, you know, now when I catastrophize, I say, there's your old friend catastrophizing. So you need to say, oh, there's my old friend minimizing. I always minimize. How do you effectively get stubborn people to recognize their own cognitive distortions? You know, wouldn't it be nice if we could do the learning for others? I think that what we do is we point out how excited we are to learn this material, and then we let it go because we can't make anybody do something they don't want to do. Some people come to this workshop and they say, there are other people in my lab that really need to hear it, and I can't get them to come. What should I do? And I say, well, just put up the cognitive distortion slide or the handout. I'll send you a handout as well with more examples. Just put it up, or just share how much you enjoyed it, or share that you went to the discussion group on cognitive distortions and you learned a lot. You know, and sometimes people will hear that and join. Some people aren't ready to join, and you just have to accept that. But you can't effectively get others to recognize anything they don't want to recognize. Is it negative to assume yourself as an imposter and tell yourself that so you keep pushing, right? So you're using it as a motivator. I don't know. I suppose there are some people who would say that motivating myself in that way works. I know there are people who motivate themselves by catastrophizing. I think I used to do a lot of that. I think it's exhausting in the long term. So I guess I would say anything used in a small degree might actually be okay. But things way overused, you're constantly telling yourself, I'm an imposter, I'm fake, I'm not going to make it, the next one's going to be a disaster. I think that might be exhausting over time. And so I think you're going to need to ask yourself, is it helping or hurting? And if it's helping in the short term but hurting in the long term, well, that's an issue too. At what point do you know that you might need professional help, like a counselor or a therapist, to deal with cognitive distortions and imposter fears? I think that, again, pausing to ask yourself, how am I really feeling, right? Like, am I generally an upbeat person who is enjoying school and enjoying life and enjoying my colleagues and seeing challenge and feeling motivated by it? Or am I constantly worried? And if the answer is, I wake up every day and there's a pit in my stomach, or my jaw is clenched, my throat is tight, if I'm constantly worried, I think we need to say that sign that I'm worried more than I'm not worried, that I'm unhappy more than I'm happy, that's a sign that we want to reach out and talk to a counselor. The thing is that it's not that something's wrong with you to go see a counselor. It's that you'd like things to be better than they already are. You know, I have had times in my life where I spoke with a counselor out of real distress, but I've had other times where I talked to a counselor because I had a really positive feeling about where I was and I wanted to really take advantage of some things, or I wanted to tweak some relationships. I think if we let go of the fact that we go when there's a problem, we can just go and say, I have this feeling that sometimes imposter fears are getting in the way and I'd love to talk about it. And so I think you want to ask yourself how you're feeling and ask yourself what's holding you back. There's some thank yous where people point out how much they find themselves comparing themselves to others. I really, really think that all of us as mentors have driven that behavior some. I think as a community, we drive it in each other. I think the internet drives it. And I think some element of looking and noting what other people have is just a part of being human. And again, we just want to soften our tendency to do that. So some people share that they like to use fake it till you make it to get through imposter fears. And I think that's great. If it's working for you, that's absolutely fine. I think that there, I mean, a lot of people say it and a lot of people find it very comforting. I think for me, the idea of faking it is very stress inducing, which is why I put out that other sort of thought about that. But clearly it works for some people. Thank you for talking about these things. I'm making a decision to leave the pre-med track. I need more time and reflection to see what's right. Maybe grad school, but I know medicine is not really right. I mean, this is an example of what happens when we pause and develop self-awareness, is we realize what's right for us. Think about the messages we get growing up. Oh, you're smart, you should be a doctor. Like, really? Like, based on what, right? If we ask 5-year-olds, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, how could they possibly know? But really, how could a high school person know? I mean, you might have more of an inkling than a 5-year-old, but how can we expect you to know out of the wealth of things available what you really want to be? Parents put expectations, teachers put expectations, culture puts expectations. And somehow under all those loud voices of others, you have to find your voice, and it can take some time. And it's an amazing journey, but once you figure out what you really want to do, it's so huge. Like, to be who we really want to be is really an amazing thing. Somebody asked about seeing Teo. He actually left, but I promise you next time I'll give you a chance to see Teo. Tomorrow, if you want to watch the chat, it's Pride at NIH. Thank you, Charles C. There are many, many more questions here. It is 4:11. I have been going for a long time. I have 3 more minutes. So I'm going to apologize for those of you whose question I didn't get to answer. If it seems really like, if you have a question and you're like, I can't believe she didn't get to this, please email me and I will do my best to send you an answer. Somebody said, what resources do I recommend for working through distortions? Some of those links on the YouTube videos most of them are about cognitive distortions. I'm hoping in the group next week that we'll provide even more resources. So if you don't feel that you get all the resources you need, let me know by email. And I'm going to wrap up with this one question. Do imposter fears ever go away? For some people, they soften a lot and become almost, just a sort of small, soft chatter in the background. For some, they're often a small chatter in the background, and then they become a huge storm when something new happens. For some, they're a constant struggle and battle. It just depends. It depends on where they come from. It depends on how you deal with them. It depends on all kinds of things. The more you study now to figure them out, the more you work on skills to address them, the less likely it is that they will be a big problem moving forward. But they might still creep up. You know, I've worked a lot to catastrophize a lot less, and most of the time I can do that, but boy, sometimes by the end of the work week, it's hard for me to remember that. So I have to go back to my wellness practice, right? The more you integrate all the material we're talking about, the less likely it will be that these things loom large. And that's really our challenge in everything, right? Is to develop the skills that help us deal with all of the struggles that we have with a little bit more ease. So with that, I'm going to wrap up for this week. I will see you in 2 weeks. I hope that I'll see some of you tomorrow on the chat. I hope that many of you will join the groups next week. I know that they were really good the first week, and I am sure they're going to be good this time. So with that, thank you all. Be well. Stay at home as much as you can. Wash your hands. Take care of yourself. Like Dr. Fauci said yesterday, the next 2 weeks are critical in this pandemic. We all need to hold on to social distancing, to masks, to really, really being aware that this pandemic is not over. So take care of yourselves and be well. Thank you.